Which ancient holidays influenced Christmas? Why did the ancients know how to throw such a good party? And what was the real story around Jesus' birth? Hello, this is Anya Leonard, founder and director of Classical Wisdom. You're listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. Today I'm speaking with an old friend and our resident classicist, Ben Potter, on the ancient influences on Christmas and the historical context of Jesus' birth and death. But before we begin, a quick thank you to our Classical Wisdom Society members who make this podcast possible. If you would like to become a society member and help support the classics, please go to classicalwisdom.com and click Start Here. Now on to ancient holidays and the Lord of Misrule. So we are approaching the holiday season. And like every year, it's always interesting because the holidays, our current manifestations of them, have deep ancient roots, and most people are completely oblivious to them, which is why I always think it's nice to sort of point out some of these traditions that have existed for thousands of years that we are continuing unknowingly. And so Christmas, though, we don't really know exactly which holiday influenced it, or many holidays, or just the fact that it's at a time of year when people have holidays. But the first one normally people like to think of is Saturnalia.
So, yeah, I think you absolutely put your finger on it there. We're talking about which holidays influenced it, and the nature of these holidays coming in year after year after year. It's this snowball effect. Is that it wouldn't be right. It's quite a nice, neat thing to say Saturnalia was Roman Christmas, or Christmas is modern day Saturnalia, and doesn't really map exactly. But if you see this little snowball of the festival going through the countries, through the centuries, and they just pick up little bits here, little bits there. So you get a bit from Saturnalia, you might get a bit from the birthday of Sol Invictus, you might get something from Yule, and it picks up all these things down and down and down the years. And the other thing you were saying about the time of year, it's solstice time. So solstice time is, through so many civilizations, through so many countries, through so many years, is the time to have some sort of festival. If you follow the solar calendar especially, some countries that follow the lunar calendar more are less bothered about solstices, but if you have a solar calendar culture, then you're definitely looking for the solstices as being very important events in your year.
Well, I should just say yesterday I accidentally missed a solar eclipse, so
oh no,
pretty gutted about that. I gotta say, I looked on social media today and I was like, "What? There was a social." Anyways, so maybe we should focus then on going with your snowball analogy. You know, we have our modern day snowman with his little hat on. Maybe we should start at the bottom snowball and sort of just give a little recap maybe on some of those snow features.
Okay.
So to start with Saturnalia then, which traditionally takes place, December 17th to the 23rd, depending on which calendar you want to go with.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is, to our calendar, December the 17th is the day. That's like Saturnalia Day. And Saturnalia's had a sort of messy history because it seemed to be one day. This is in Rome, so it was one day, and by the end of the Roman Republic, so sort of in the 1st century BC, it looks like it's got down up to 5 days of revelry. And then Augustus, big killjoy Augustus, he puts it down to 3 days, which you think would be really difficult to do now, to chop 2 days off a public holiday and say everyone back to work.
Yeah, that'd be right. Yeah.
Yeah, but this fits quite well into Augustus's character, because he also passed the Lex Julii, the very sort of Puritan marriage laws.
Which he didn't follow himself, by the way.
Which he didn't follow
Yeah,
himself.
but he did banish his daughter,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, he sort of he didn't do it for himself, but he did it for his daughters. So he nearly had principles.
Yeah,
on that one.
nearly. Okay.
Yeah. And then it got up to 5 days, I think, on the Caligula, and then so 7 days sometime. And I think it's who is it? Linny, I think, is talking about how it's basically the whole month of December is just a mess. Sort of, it's December because people are outside being all drunk and useless. Oh, sorry, not Pliny. It was Seneca who said that. Seneca was a big downer on Saturnalia, as you can imagine, being a staid philosopher as he was.
Well, there's other things I could say about Seneca being hypocritical as well, but that's another thing.
Yeah, this is not the hypocrisy hour.
Yeah. Let's trash the rich Seneca. No. So yes, it does sound like it was such an awesome party. People didn't want it to stop. So I mean, there's definitely a few features of it that remind us of our current holidays, and maybe we can get to that afterwards. But maybe the first to talk about is some of the ways in which it was nothing like our current holiday, because they had a couple of really fun features, and one of which I always thought was a very interesting one was the role reversal.
Yeah. This is a huge thing for Saturnalia, for this this, I suppose you'd call it, if you had to call it one thing, rather than a solstice festival, it'd probably be sort of an end of agriculture festival, an end of agricultural oil festival, because you've had October, November during your harvest time. You've done all your winter sowing of seeds for the next spring, and now there's nothing else to do. So let's go crazy, and let's have a drink. And the role reversal was a big thing, and it was a time when you can just sort of unleash yourself, and you do things you're not supposed to do. So you get excessively drunk. Whilst we always think about the ancient world and wine, but excessive drinking was not something that was definitely frowned upon. So that seemed to be the biggest feature of Saturnalia, as far as all the sources tell us, is the excessive drinking. And it seems to be basically you're not allowed to be sober for all of that time.
Yeah, I think Alexander the Great would have loved that party, right?
He would have loved it. But I mean, anybody who's been a freshman in college, you sort of know by towards the end of the week, there's a moment when you think, yeah, there is too much of a good thing. I could just do with the.
Well, so I was thinking too about the role reversal in that that the masters would wait on the slaves or the servants, and that's quite a strange thing for us to envision in the ancient world, that would be allowed, and that for a holiday the masters would want to do that.
Yeah, well, this is a bit murky, because I mean, a big problem with Saturnalia is that because it was so ubiquitous, it was the number one holiday of the year. It was the holiday everybody knew about. So nobody really wrote about it that much. It was people make a little comment here, a little comment there. There's something in Livy, there's something in Seneca, there's something in Tacitus. But nobody feels like you need to sit someone down and say, this is what Saturnalia is, because we all know what it is. So what's the big deal about writing about it? It would have been really helpful if a foreigner like Polybius coming in from Greece had said, what's going on here? Let's document Saturnalia very carefully. But we don't have a really clear idea of how it was. But there is this idea of, for this week, slaves are free, or for however many days Saturnalia is at that time, slaves are free. They wear the pileus, which is the hat that's given to you when you're emancipated as a slave. So you get to wear the hat of a freedman for that week. And like you say, you get waited on by the master. This is not really clear. It's impossible to imagine that the masters became slaves and the slaves became masters for that amount of time. First of all, you need a lot more people to do the slave work than there are masters. So it wouldn't, just in terms of numbers, wouldn't add up. Is that if you're a rich guy and you have 5 slaves, you can't do the work of 5 slaves and serve your 5 slaves. So it's thought to be probably a symbolic thing. Perhaps the slaves prepared the food and then they ate and then they cleared it away, and you sort of symbolically waited on them. It was just a sort of a nice moment in the
Yeah,
day.
I'm totally imagining like Downton Abbey or something,
Yeah.
the folks downstairs sit upstairs and the folks upstairs sit
Mm.
downstairs. Yeah, I can only really envision it being symbolic because I think they did. I mean, especially when you imagine how much effort went into making bread and
Yeah.
preparing chicken. It's a whole day's event. So
Stoking the fires, carrying things around. It's just
would the masters even known how to do all of that?
Exactly. It's. I mean, there are some theories about it. One theory, which I find very believable, is that perhaps it was it was an incentive for good slaves through the year. So you get a slave who's really done well, excelled themselves in their role, and you say, "That was great. You get Saturnalia off." And so you might have this idea of some slaves and you sort of symbolically serving the good slaves. So I find that very believable, but we don't really know about this. But there was definitely this role reversal. Even if it was only symbolic, there was this idea of everything's topsy-turvy, everything's upside down. And what goes on in Saturnalia is not just not normal, it's the opposite of what should happen during normal periods of the year.
And you can imagine what that would do for society to have this moment when you can question everything, because if you think in societies where you have slavery and people are born into slavery and they die into slavery, they don't often get to test what it feels like to not be a slave. And that would be purposeful in those slave owning societies. So to allow the role reversal, you would think that would open up Pandora's box, so to speak.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've heard both sides of this, and this side of it is very compelling. The idea that do you want to get them to taste this amount of freedom? The two caveats for that is one, if it's the reward for good behavior through the year, or two, try to incentivize them to be so good in the future that you will make them a freedman. So that's one side. The other side of it is saying that this is actually cruel, is giving them the one day of freedom only reinforces what a wretched existence they actually have. Instead of, okay, today I'm serving you, tomorrow and the day after and the day after, it's not going to be like this. And it's actually a sort of ritualized role reversal that puts you in your place even more as well. Mm-hmm. So it's hard to know how the psychology of it would work.
Yeah, and I guess the point too, though, is that slavery as a position was much more fluid then too. It wasn't, people had periods of being slaves and not being slaves. It was much more common to go in and out of slavery within one's life.
Yeah, it's people are not familiar with the ancient world. They think about slavery. They think about more modern slavery. They think about the Middle Passage and the USA and the Civil War and things like this, and that doesn't really map onto how slavery was in the ancient world. It maps on in terms of you don't have any freedom and your life is worth nothing and you're a non-person. But like you say, you could be a prince one day and a slave the next. It's if you just happen to lose the wrong war, you could.
Now, just to stay back on the holiday theme, another element I think that was always interesting.
You don't think slavery is enough of a nice Christmassy thing?
Yeah, jing-a-ling-ling, the sleigh bells of ring. There was a bad joke in there that I totally messed up.
Absolutely.
So I was going to say to go back to the holiday theme. One element I think that's interesting is the Lord of Misrule.
Yes, very nice.
And you had that in British Christmases until recently, right? That's not one that's been lost completely.
Until recently, if you think about it in how in our view of history, yes, recently. So probably 1400 or 1500 or something like that. But yeah, it was a very similar thing. The sort of the Lord of the Revels, the Saturnalia princeps, I think is what it's called. Which, if you make the C softer, it becomes a Saturnalicious, which is wonderful. So it's the king of Saturnalia. Yeah, it's somebody whose job it is just to say to keep the party moving. Basically, is how it's supposed to be. That's the spirit of it. It's you see somebody stooped in the corner, not doing anything. Say, hey, you drink now, and you put some wine in their hands. Or the party's not going very well. It's a bit boring. You say, okay, you take your clothes off, go outside and sing a song.
Yeah.
And it's very Roman, this reversal, because it's sort of ritualized freedom. It's ritualized anarchy. So it's anarchy, but because it's Rome, it's very, very structured, and it's very hierarchical as well. And like I said, with the slaves and the masters, the hierarchy is reversed, but we still understand the hierarchy. And this is, you are required to be drunk, and you're required to be silly. And the master of the revels is there to give you not just permission to behave badly, but to enforce you to behave badly. So I'm standing outside in the snow, naked, with a glass of wine in my hand, singing a song. And the neighbors look out the window and say, the master of the rebels have got him. The king of Saturnalia has got him. So it's doing bad things, but giving you an absolute pass to do all these bad things. So next week, when I talk to my neighbors, there's no embarrassment, there's no problems about any of this.
I think this is a tradition we should bring back. Because, well, look, anybody who...
Really? It's really cold. It's really cold here, I don't live in Argentina.
I know, it's summer right now. No, I mean, but like anybody who, like I like to throw a good party. Like I'm pretty good at being a hostess, I like to think. And there is like a whole set of unspoken rules that if you really want a good party, you got to have the right kind of music. You got to judge changing the music according. You got to have the right lighting. You got to have the right amount of snacks, a different kind of variety of drinks. Like you got to have a good setup. You got, like there's a lot of work that goes into throwing a good party. And I feel like, some people lose that talent that, maybe we should have like a Lord or Misrule service that, make sure that everybody has a good time.
Yeah, I can definitely empathize with this idea because I had to organize a stag do. What's American for stag do? Bachelor party.
Bachelor party.
That's it. And I just didn't really organize it. I just thought, okay, we're all friends, we all turn up, we'll have a good time. No, I got everything wrong. I realized that, actually, you probably do need the Lord of the Revels. You do need the King of Saturnalia sometimes to keep the party moving.
So drinking was absolutely essential to this party. And I think actually this is a bit my theory. I have a theory you were saying about it not being written that much about, and because everybody knew it. Is there a chance that nobody wrote about it because they were all just too smashed to write about it? And they might not even remember what happened.
So what did we do?
Yeah.
Anyone remember?
Like you wake up the next morning, you're like, whoa, let's get some clues. What's happened here? They might not want to have written about it. So I guess we have a little bit of that drinking element in our current holidays. But Saturnalia wasn't the only ancient holiday that influenced our modern holidays. There was another Roman holiday that was about honoring children. Am I correct? That was the Juvenalia. Do you know that?
Juvenalia, yes. I don't know very much about it, but but educate me. I want to know about the Juvenalia.
I actually don't know that much about it either. I was just thinking about, because I was just thinking that nowadays a huge element of Christmas is about children, really. And Saturnalia is not so much about children. That just sounds like parents having a good time. I don't know who watched after the kids during Saturnalia.
This is a really interesting thing.
Another element kind of thrown into our snowball mix.
But this is a really interesting thing about our modern Christmas being for kids is a super modern thing. This is probably Dickensian. This is probably Victorian, and really Dickensian, because some people have the idea that Charles Dickens actually invented modern Christmas. Because, with Scrooge, he's been redeemed. He leans out the window, so go and get me the biggest goose in the shop. And people weren't eating goose at that time. They're eating pig, they're eating pork, and even hog's heads, it seemed to be, as a Christmas thing. So it seemed just in this one moment that Charles Dickens changed everybody into eating fowl for Christmas instead of eating pork. And other aspects of this, it was the Victorians who seemed to really make Christmas a kid's holiday rather than an adult's holiday, because going back to the Middle Ages with the Lord of Misrule in England, it was all about adults getting because they could and just letting off some steam, because if you're an agricultural worker, you've been working solid for months and months and months and months and months. And if you had anything to do with that industry, then you've been working solid as well. And it was the time to really let yourself go. And the kids thing seems to really be a Victorian thing, as far as we know. So I don't know about the Juvenalia. That would be interesting to see the tie-ins for that.
Okay, so that might be just working our way backwards, trying to find things that fit into, which it happens. I mean, a lot. People want to draw more connections sometimes than there are. So maybe continuing with drawing connections that may or may not exist. There's another one, the birthday of Mithra.
Well, Mithras or Mithra is a very, very murky god. For anyone not familiar with Mithras, it was a mystery religion. So it was by its very nature, it comes from the mystery religion comes from Greek, meaning to not speak. So it's a secret. What happens in our religion is absolutely secret. You can't tell anybody. It's similar to the Eleusinian mysteries. And Mithra, without an S, was a Iranian or Indian god, and it seems to have come across to the west, to Greece and to Rome, maybe picked up by soldiers on the borders of empire, and eventually becomes Mithras. And Mithras has this connection to Sol Invictus, Sol, the unconquered, Sol the mighty, the sun god, the mighty sun god. And there's this idea that Sol Invictus is the father and Mithras is the son, but because it's a mystery religion, we don't know anything about it really. And the only thing we know about it is from Christian scholars, because people who worship Mithras, by the very nature of being a devotee, were not allowed to write about it, and Christians wrote about it because they write about it in a way that makes you start to some alarm bells go ring, because they basically write about it saying fake news on Mithraism. They say Mithraism, these rituals they do, these rites that they do, they're ours. We made those up. They didn't make those up. So there's obviously some people we're talking about who really made up these rites. So there's this comment about there's a Christian, I think it might have been Tertullian, was writing about Mithraism, saying they didn't invent Eucharist, we did. And you think, well, why would you say that? So there's obviously some sketchiness in there about this. And there's even this idea that the devil invented Mithraism and predated it to the birth of Christ in order to try to discredit Christ. So there's all this very murky stuff about Mithraism, and it's really impossible to understand anything about it, because 99% of the evidence we have is archaeological. Nobody really writes about it, apart from Christians trying to slam it. So we don't really know about it. But yes, it definitely, Sol Invictus is the 25th of December, is a special day for Sol Invictus, and Mithras gets latched on to this, and we think perhaps 25th of December was the birthday of Mithras as well. It's the start of the Mithraic New Year, but it's all murky. It's all very, very murky. People who like to defend their cause get very, very, very upset if you sort of mention Mithras was perhaps a proto-Christ or a parallel Christ.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's always interesting to me because all the different religions are so influenced by each other, that you do see these echoes and these parallels with just about all of them. And I know there's also another correlation with the Iranian Persian winter solstice, and there's also just a lot of holidays at that time.
Yeah,
there's
it's
a lot
holiday
of
time. It's about the rebirth of the sun. The sun is dying. The days are getting to their shortest if you live in the northern hemisphere.
Yeah.
And then it's being reborn. So there's this idea of the rebirth of the sun, which is very, very important for all of these solstice celebrations, it seems. And it makes sense. There is a big party around this time. And like I said, for agricultural workers, their work is done for the moment. They have done their harvesting. They've done their winter sowing. They can't do much else yet. So they might have some perishable foods they've just harvested. So why not have a big party?
Yeah, I gotta say, as much as I love living in South America, the Southern Hemisphere holiday season is just, winter goes on forever and there's nothing to celebrate. There's no break in winter. It's just like a long winter. And then in the summertime, when you don't need a holiday, there's all these holidays and you're like, oh, I've got to, handle Christmas. Can't I just be at the beach? So it's.
Well, that's really interesting because that would speak to the thirst for Northern Hemisphere people to need a holiday at this time of the year, wouldn't it?
Oh yeah, it's amazing. Like maybe also it's partially because growing up originally in the Northern Hemisphere, I'm used to being a holiday, but yeah, we definitely live in a Northern centric culture and worldwide in that these like major holidays are still sort of focused in the Northern Hemisphere rather than for Southerners. But just to say, it's interesting because you mentioned the sun a few times. So yeah, the birthday of Mithra is the god of the incomparable sun. And then there was another holiday that was in 274 with the Roman Emperor Aurelian, which is the Dies Naturalis Solis Invictus, which is the birthday of the unconquered sun. So we keep getting this sun reference over and over again, which kind of ties in with the whole, son of God thing too.
Yeah, so it's absolutely. It works for Jesus. Jesus is the light, is the way. It's Saturn is bringing you out in the Saturnalia, is bringing you out of the dark times and into the new, and it's time to celebrate to do that. And yes, 274. It's Emperor Aurelian makes Sol Invictus a state religion. It's recognized as a state religion. It's not. There's no prohibition on others at this moment. We're still living in monotheistic Rome in 274. But yes, so Sol Invictus is becoming this great god coming in, which doesn't really go away. It actually gets merged by Constantine when he comes to the throne and it's talking about Constantine the Great. People are a bit sketchy when he converts. He officially converted to Christianity on his deathbed, but it seemed from 312 AD, that was when he was very, very tolerant and very generous to Christians after he won the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, which basically made him the Emperor of Rome against all the odds.
So I think, though, would a lot of modern Christians not acknowledge that 274 date because there was already plenty of Christians talking about the birth of Christ before that? So that might be more coincidental or post-fact rather than an influencer.
Well, that would be a really good argument if we'd heard about Jesus being born on the 25th, before that, which we hadn't. So Jesus being born on the 25th of December comes up in 354. So we have a calendar which has the birthday of Solon, the birth of Solon Victus, the birth of Christ on the 25th of December. So it's really quite, it takes 350 years for anybody to say Christ was born on the 25th of December. And there's some passages from the Gospels which make you think, well, he probably wasn't. Shepherds watch their flocks by night. Not in December, they don't. They go in the barn. They don't stay outside and it's freezing cold. I mean, even in Judea, it's freezing cold in December. So you don't stay out with your sheep. You go into the barn.
So maybe we should switch gears a little bit to the history then of the birth of Jesus, which is sort of what is considered nowadays the reason for Christmas. You touched on the time of year. I know a lot of people also bring up other major Jewish holidays that would have been the reason for people to come back to Judea and therefore have a Roman census. So there's, I think, two major holidays, but it probably would have more likely the birth of Jesus would have been in either the spring or the fall, like you said, because of the fact that you have sheep in a barn and during the winter. And so the two major holidays it would have been either Passover or the Feast of the Tabernacles, the Sukkot. So yeah, definitely on either end of the Christmas time period that we know today.
Yeah. So yeah, this is another flake of the snowball. Is talking about just this all maps on beautifully, and it's difficult sometimes for people in general, but especially if you're quite devoutly Christian, to get your head around the idea that your special festival might have been the Saturnalia, might have been something to do with Mithras or Solon Victus or any of these things. But everybody seems quite comfortable with the idea that, oh yes, it was Judaism and then Christianity, and that was the blueprint for Christianity. We can't have Christianity without Judaism. It seems to be
Jesus
perfect.
was Jewish. I mean,
exactly.
kind of key, really. And he was the king of the Jews. I mean, like, gotta be bringing something to the party, right? Like,
it's the king of the Jews. What's going on here? Yeah. So this is absolutely fine for Christians all over the world to realize this connection between Judaism and Christianity, even if historically it's been rather problematic. So let's be polite. But the idea that we get these pagan festivals that get mapped onto Christianity seems to be more of a controversial idea. But yeah, absolutely, we've got these Jewish festivals at the same time. Perhaps I'm sure you'll know much more about Jewish festivals than I will, but perhaps for similar reasons. Perhaps this time of year is the solstice. It's a good time to celebrate. It's a good time to stop work and sit down and have some fun. But in terms of, you mentioned the census, and that's where there's an interesting thing about the census, because that's where the Gospels have a big hole in them, which sort of paradoxically make Christ more of a realistic historical character. Because we have the prophecies from the Old Testament from Isaiah and Micah, and one of them says the Messiah, the Savior, must be born from the house of David, from the stem of Jesse, is what he says. So going down the house of David, and Joseph comes into that. He's in the house of David. And there's this very long, boring passage from the Bible saying, so-and-so begat so-and-so, begat so-and-so, begat so-and-so, coming down to prove that Joseph is from the house of David. And the other thing is saying that the Savior, the Messiah, will be born in Bethlehem. And Jesus and his Joseph and Mary are in Nazareth, and we need to get them to Bethlehem, otherwise the prophecy is not correct. And so they crowbar in the census thing. And what we know is, they say there was a census of the entire Roman world. And what we know is there was never a census of the entire Roman world. Censuses didn't happen in winter, but maybe that was not a problem because maybe Jesus wasn't really born in winter. And there's this really sort of thing slipped in under the radar that you need to go back to your hometown for your census. And you don't. It was never a thing that you need to go back to your hometown for your census. And if you think about it, it would be insane if I had to go back to Liverpool for a census when I'm living somewhere around the world. I mean, the Roman Empire isn't quite as open as the world is today, but people did live in different countries. And what matters for the census is that was where you're paying tax and where you're residing. So this was never a thing that you have to go back to your hometown for the census. But the fact that the Gospels insist you must have to go back to your hometown for the census means they want to put Joseph and Mary back in Bethlehem. Because if they were just making it all up, they could just say they were just from Bethlehem. That's where they lived. That's where they grew up. That's where they always were. So it sort of, paradoxically, it makes the story stronger in terms of there probably was a guy who was in Nazareth, and how are we going to get him into Bethlehem? We need to make up a little twist the story to get him into Bethlehem.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, it is interesting that it's sort of maybe non-intuitive that would be a point of proof. But I mean, I guess what the difficulties though with things like census is that like people can be annoyingly bureaucratic. I mean, you say that like they wouldn't make them go back. I'm like, well, I don't know. Maybe that's like.
Well, we don't have any evidence for that. Anybody had to go back to their hometown. I mean,
you live in Italy. I'm sure there's some really random bureaucratic laws sometimes that. Yeah.
I'm still waiting on my citizenship after 2.5 years. So yeah, so there are bureaucratic things.
You can make people do some weird paperwork things, and that's even been a strategy in different time periods to exclude or include people. And yeah, but to go back,
it would be surprising that no other scholar mentions that people have to go to their hometown for the census.
Yeah.
So I mean, it doesn't mean it's impossible. It's just it's surprising.
So going back to the sort of historical elements. The date 0 or 1, I mean, that's obviously what it's more between 2 BC and 7 BC would have been the birth of Jesus. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the common thought about it. But I've heard all sorts of things from about from 3 BC to 10 AD. So it's people are a bit sketchy in their ideas. But I think it's the most reliable dates I hear are from 3 to 7. Seems to be what most people seem to land on. And I couldn't tell you exactly why, because I don't have that level of attention to go through that myself. But
and there's a lot of scholars who do. I mean, and it's really fascinating work that they're doing, and in regards to studying this time period. And I guess maybe to sort of finish up, because of the focus of classical wisdom is really the Greco-Roman world, and it's very interesting because the birth and life of Jesus is a very important part of this world, but but he's also it's interesting to know the context of his birth and death and following. So maybe we can conclude by just giving a brief sketch of what the ancient world looked like when Jesus was potentially born. So the emperor was
Augustus.
Yep.
And it's Augustus, and it's Augustus really having solidified his power, and where there's in the early days of Octavian Augustus, we know we have the rivalry, the war against Mark Antony and Cleopatra and things like this, and that's all gone. That's 20 years in the past. So there's no threat to Augustus. He's in his in the autumn of his years, he's changing his perception of him. There's a famous statue of Augustus from Prima Porta, which is the sort of sexy young Augustus with his arm out. He's covered in armor. It's if you don't know Augustus from Porta, just Google it, and it's him as a soldier, as a warrior. And in the latter years of his reign, he's transforming himself into an elder statesman and into a priest. If you see the Areopagus Augustae, which is in the Uffizi Museum in Florence, and shows him as a priest and a holy man. So he was trying to transform himself into this image, and it was the great age of Roman peace. Rome hadn't had war on its doorsteps, and the gates of Rome were open 3 times. So it means that the gates of Rome are open means we are so safe. We have so much peace. Nobody's attacking us. So it's the great age of Roman security in terms of any threat from outside marauders. It doesn't mean they weren't making war. They were just killing foreigners in foreign lands. So that's fine.
Yeah.
It also gives soldiers a good stipend. So everything's great.
Yeah, I won't make any modern comparisons to that.
No. And in terms of Judea, Judea was part of the empire. There was some rumblings, some Jewish uprisings against the Romans, but in general, it was a well-governed province. Everything was sort of ticking along pretty well. If Judea had been in a state of real revolt, like it had been and then would be very much, then the story of Jesus would have been more of a soldier. It would have been more like the story of Muhammad. But it was in terms of as a Roman citizen, it was a very, very tranquil, easy time for Rome. Everything was absolutely peaceful, and perhaps, you never know, maybe the fact that nothing weird and bonkers was happening was somebody felt like they needed to shake things up by looking for new meaning in life. As we find in our times, we've never lived a more peaceful, easy time, and people are beginning to sort of lose direction a bit and lose purpose with themselves. So perhaps this is an echo from history.
I don't know if 2020 really fits in with that. Well, on that positive and optimistic note, I'll just say to everyone listening, actually, that this month's Classical Wisdom Literary Magazine will be dedicated to the history around the history of Jesus. So if you're interested in learning more about the time period throughout the Greco-Roman world in which Jesus was born and lived and died, then that will be an interesting magazine for you. And so I just will conclude then with saying thank you, Ben, for joining us this week and shedding a bit of light on the ancient holidays. And I hope everybody is choosing who will be the Lord of Misrule for your Christmas celebrations, whether it's via Zoom call or not, that we can have the Lord of Zoom rule or something, I don't know. Thank you for listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds.